Good afternoon. This is Life Along the Merrimack, the weekly podcast where we talk about the history and health of the Merrimack River. It goes out on 96.3 Joppa Radio. We're seen on Comcast, local station, and we come here every week to talk about different elements of the river. One interesting fact that's happening now along the river is one of our great poets in Newburyport is actually being considered to be the poet at Joe Biden's inauguration. This is true. Her name is Rena Espaillat, and she has been a leading poet in the region for 2 decades. She's a part of Powwow Poets. She's published in this country. She's published in the Dominican Republic. She's a big star there. She's a native of the Dominican Republic. And there's even a street named after her in the Dominican Republic. So this would be a very exciting thing for Newburyport to have one of our own residents speak at the inauguration. Now, as I understand it, a lot of jockeying is going on. But people are calling Congressman Seth Moulton. They might be calling Senator Ed Markey. And I think it's just an interesting project for the locals around here to see if there could be a local poet to be part of the inauguration. So again, you're not going to see Rena Espaillat in a kayak today, but it is part of life along the Merrimack, if you will. And then the subject of poetry, John GreeneWhittier, of course, was one of the great poets of the 19th century. He was from the Amesbury-Haverhill area, and he wrote a wonderful poem, Merrimack. He was in about 1849, 1859 in that area. And I mention that because it's going to be in my book. I have written a book titled Merrimack, the Resilient River, and it's being put to press as we speak. Now, put to press is rather a broad statement. It's been edited for the first time. I have 80 photos and they have passed muster. In other words, the resolution is adequate. They're in focus. And so they're assembling everything right now at History Press in Charleston, South Carolina. Now they send me the book back and I look at it to make sure there are no typos, to make sure the captions go with the photos, but it is an exciting moment. And this book on the Merrimack River will be published in April, I am told. But I do mention it because John GreeneWhittier is one of the big names in the Merrimack region. The new bridge, of course, over the Merrimack is called the Whittier Bridge. And so I'm knee deep in the river, if we can call it that. And also I want to talk today about a few things. I have some new photos and that I want to show you. I spoke to the Merrimack River Watershed Council last week and, got some good feedback from them. I added some photos to my presentation. And it reminds me also to be aware that I'm on the radio. Now, how could I not be aware of that, right? I just announced we're on 99.6 Joppa Radio. But sometimes when I show slides, I'm afraid I forget that I'm on the radio. Some folks can't see them. And so as I go through a few slides, I will attempt to remember some people are listening and not watching. But this is the Merrimack, as you can see. The 2 jetties are there. It's a shallow river. This is the inlet. It's been here discovered in 1605 by the French. 1635 is when the first settlers came. It's always been a very shallow mouth of the river, from 12 to 16 feet draw, depending on the tide. And it's always been amazing to me that the community became such a vibrant shipbuilding community, a vibrant trade community, when we had a mouth of the river that was shallow. And, with a strong tide coming in and a strong current coming down from the river, it was often very difficult to navigate. So more power to everybody who made this a remarkable place. And here you can see it begins in central New Hampshire, comes down, and of course comes into Newburyport. There's a great shipbuilding community, as you can see. Richard Burke Jones, a local artist, painted this. This is about 1853. You can see how large the ships were. They went all over the world. And when there was a launching, as this happened with the Symington about 1893, it was a tremendous event. People dressed up. You can see women in the foreground. You can see some youngsters who took the day off from school. And I'm always amazed at how large these vessels were. Look at how small the people on that vessel looks like. 300 feet long, over 500 tons, quite remarkable. And in this period of time, if the ships got too large, they could leave the harbor on high tide, but they could not come back laden with cargo. They were too heavy in the water. And remember, it's a shallow harbor. So that was one reason why Newburyport kind of peaked as a shipbuilding area and peaked as a trade area. We did not get into iron and steel ships. There were a few built, but again, because they went low in the water, it was a shallow harbor. In about 1893, we stopped making large ships because if they were laden with cargo, they could not return. A new era started in the 1820s when mills began to appear on the Merrimack River. Here's Pawtucket Falls and Lowell. You can see the strength of that. And scientists used new theories of the day to develop hydropower. The hydropower ran the mills, and the Merrimack became one of the greatest sites of making cotton and wool in the whole country. Henry David Thoreau, the great thinker and poet, was very concerned about this. He felt, if you keep putting mills on the river, if you keep making dams and canals, the fish are not going to be able to go upriver anymore. And he was right. But that didn't stop the mills from being made. So 1822 or 23 in Lowell were the first mills, 1847 in Lawrence, and they kept being built from there on in. This is the Spigot River in Lawrence. This was, you can see how many smokestacks there are. The air got dirty, the water got dirty, and the railroad did come, and that was helpful for a while. Of course, the cotton was sent up from the south. It was put into cotton and wool here and then sent back to be marketed. And here is the Spigot River in Lawrence. Here, Lawrence also was known for its very large clock. At one time, it was among the largest in the world, only a few feet smaller than Big Ben in London. It was helpful, not only for the time, but a lot of mill workers would be walking around and they would keep an eye on it because a lot of them did not have their own pocket watches, so they could tell when the shift started. And at the bottom here, you can see one of the largest mills. And if you've ever been on 495 or been through Lawrence, even today, the mills seem enormous. And this is a tremendously large mill, and those communities employed thousands. The Merrimack could get nasty. Here's a remarkable photo from 1936 in Manchester, New Hampshire. That's the Amazigh Manufacturing Company, some of their buildings on the left. And this was probably the final blow to Amazigh. They had started, say, in 1840 in Manchester and was one of the largest mill operations in the world. By the 1930s, though, they were about finished. Mills were unionizing. They weren't making repairs on the mills. And a lot of the managers wanted to move south because costs were cheaper. But 1936, this was an incredible flood, which hit the whole of New England. In Maine, the Kennebec and the Androscoggin, all of those rivers had tremendous floods. And this is quite a remarkable photo. Again, the Merrimack River, as you know, in recent years has been home ground for a lot of recreation. The river was very dirty because of the mills and other things until the early 70s, when the Clean Water Act, proposed by Senator Ed Muskie of Maine, started giving large federal grants to communities so they could create good sewage treatment plants. And so when the water got cleaner, boats came a calling. And in recent years, there have been 1,500 recreation boats on the Merrimack River just in Newburyport alone. Here is a sandbar in the center of your photo. This has always been challenging. And I'm told that when boaters come up here and haven't done their research, if they don't go along the North Jetty there and avoid that particular sandbar, they do get stuck on the sandbar. If it's low tide, it's very embarrassing because you're there for a number of hours. But that's a great shot of the opening of the Merrimack River, the sandbar that drives some boaters crazy, and just a shot at a beautiful waterway here in northern Massachusetts. The Coast Guard has always been a big part of Newburyport. The Coast Guard was founded in Newburyport in 1790. What happened was George Washington and Alexander Hamilton were talking. Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, and he said to Washington, "We don't have any money." Washington said, "Okay, do you have any ideas?" And Hamilton said, "Yes, let's create a revenue service, revenue cutter service. We'll send boats out to stop smuggling, and these boats will also board the ships coming into Newburyport and Portsmouth and New York and whatever. And they'll check the cargo to make sure these ships are paying an adequate amount of tax." So Washington gave it the okay. The first 10 were ordered in 1790. The first one was built in Newburyport. It's called the Massachusetts, and it is the reason why Newburyport is the birthplace. Sometimes you'll hear the birthplace of the Coast Guard is in Annapolis or Salem or some such, but Lyndon Johnson, president at the time, in 1965, wrote out a proclamation saying that Newburyport was indeed the birthplace of the Coast Guard. We do hear, and we see in the media, of bad, pollution coming down the river, of trees being taken down from time to time, but the river is certainly a beautiful asset still. Here's some boats in not early spring, I'd say mid-spring in Amesbury, and just showing what a beautiful spot the river still is. Maudsley State Park is across the way, about 450 acres, and we are very lucky to have that beautiful piece of semi-wilderness right here in Newburyport. In recent years, some of the mill towns have been making a comeback. Haverhill, and this picture shows that community, has made a significant return to commerce and a return to a cleaner community. This is a picture of Haverhill. On the right, you can see new apartment buildings going up with offices at the bottom. Downstream, it's upstream, you can see more apartments, but you can also see a building that is being used by UMass Lowell, have classes, and also Northern Essex Community College. So Haverhill is definitely looking good these days. If you go to Lowell, right up the river, you might want to go on this Park Service tour. It's not being given now because of COVID, but there's a wonderful national park built in Lowell in about 1978, which talks about the history of the river, but also the history of the mills on the river. And there are about 5 miles of locks and canals and different tributaries in Lowell. And this is one of the vessels that will take you on a nice trip. The Merrimack starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. And here's a beautiful shot. I took most of the photos that appear here in this, unless you can see there, unless it was taken during the 1936 flood, of course. I did not take them. And it's just really thrilling to go up the river and see some places I had never seen. And Franklin, New Hampshire is a place that was new to me. And, just look at the beauty and the purity of the river. There's some white water. Kayakers start here, canoers start here, and Franklin is where it all gets started. Now, I did go to see where the Nashua River and the Merrimack converge, and here, this is it in Nashua. I had to stumble across a parking lot of a senior citizen center to find it. This fellow was out in a walker, and I said, do you know where the Nashua and the Merrimack might converge? And he said, well, walk down the way, don't fall off that cliff, keep going, and hold on to the last tree and stick your head around. And he was about right. You can't see it from the parking lot or from any road or parking lot, but this is where the Nashua River and the Merrimack River meet in Nashua, New Hampshire. And the Merrimack is certainly strong and continues to be strong. This is in Manchester, New Hampshire. You can see the power that the mills and not the mills, but the area still generates. There are dozens of power plants still getting power from the Merrimack River. And this was new to me when I started my research. More than 500,000 people still get their drinking water from the Merrimack. That includes North Andover, Lawrence, some communities up in that direction. Now, the river is cleansed, and a lot of science goes into making the water clean. But knowing that 500,000 people drink the water is a motivation for us to try to keep the river clean. And Lowell, of course, as we talk about dams and waterways, here's an example of numerous dams, numerous ways that the river has been boarded up, if you will. So in the old days, when they wanted to have enough water to really run the plants the next day on the looms for the cotton mills, they would hold back the river, they would dam it up, and then, an hour before the first shift, they'd let it go. And that's UMass Lowell off to the right. And I had never seen this photo. So I'm glad that I was able to park my car and get out of it and just see some of the mechanizations of the river, because it's unusual. It has many, many facets to it. And this is certainly an urban facet in Lowell. Lowell, of course, does have a recreational component as it interacts with the Merrimack. This is upriver from UMass Lowell, and some people are fishing, some people are jogging, some parents are walking their kids, much like the walkway we have in Newburyport. So Lowell is getting cleaner, and I do stress that the Clean Water Act of 1972 and the amendments in 1987, which we will talk about, were very important in the development of the new Merrimack River. And the Merrimack is in Lowell again. And one musing I always have is, we know there are a tremendous amount of mill buildings in these communities, and mills were a big industry employing many, but the brick making industry must have been very large as well. In Lawrence and Lowell and Manchester and all the mill towns up in Maine where I used to live, it's a tremendous amount of bricks. So if I run out of ideas about stories to write, I think I might write one about the brick building industry. Manchester, like Haverhill and like other communities, has made a wonderful comeback since the river's been clean. You can see some of the old mill buildings on the right there, and you can see modern Manchester. There's a big hotel, there are office buildings, and in the mills now there are colleges, there are medical centers, there are restaurants. Manchester has developed over the years, and using the Merrimack River as one of its linchpins. One of the great stories of a year ago was the Voyagers. This was a group of energetic people, many of them working in the public sector, who started in Franklin, New Hampshire, which we just had a look at, and came all the way downriver in kayaks, 117 miles, took them 4 days. Sometimes it was calm, sometimes it was whitewater. That's State Representative Jim Kelkhorse in the lead and Lane Glenn behind him, who is the president of Northern Essex Community College. So this was quite an exciting event for them. After each day's paddle, they would meet with media and television stations and talk about the river and talk about the need to keep it clean. So I think the Voyagers were very useful at that period of time. Here's a quieter moment for the Voyagers. Here they are going down through a commerce space in Lowell. It says Lawrence on the manufacturing company, but I do believe it's Lowell. And there were 12 to 15. Some people only did a few days. Some people did all 4 days, but it was a very exciting event. I speak enthusiastically. I did not go, but here they are, the Voyagers. And we've talked about it. Newburyport and many other communities have become very attractive in recent years as the water has become clean. And this is an example of the Newburyport Harbor, and 1,500 vessels are tied up at that time each summer. Now, this summer was quite different, but we all know that. Beautiful shot, Amesbury and Merrimack line. And again, we hear about pollution in the river from time to time, but it's still a wonderful natural resource. Fishing vessels, there are about perhaps 8 or 10 of them were out this summer. Fishing in Newburyport used to be an enormous industry. There'd be 100 fishing ships tied up. And a lot of things happened. Fish disappeared. These large tanker ships from Norway and Japan beyond the 200-mile limit would steal thousands of fish. And also the federal government has made it very much more difficult for fish. But, the fishing vessels still look great every time I walk by the boardwalk. I always love to look at the fishing vessels, and they do go out, and there's still tuna out there. There's striped bass that come in the river. And remember, the cleaner the river gets, the more fish there will be. And here is going back to, we talked about the Voyagers. Here are two, Jim Kelkhorse in the stern, Diana DiZoglio, who's a state senator from Methuen, but she represents Newburyport, Amesbury, Salisbury, and they're in a position, I think they're taking a quiet moment, but both of those state legislators did all 4 days. Ed Muskie was one of the greats of the river. He was the head of the Clean Water Act. I knew him in the old days. I worked for the Portland Press Herald. And when he ran in 1976 to get reelected to the Senate in Maine, I got to know him pretty well. He had a national profile for some of you younger folks. He ran for vice president in 1968, and he tried to get the nomination in 1972. It was unsuccessful, but here he is, very successful, a tenacious advocate for clean water. That's his wife, Jane, behind him. Sorry, radio listeners. And again, it's 96.3 Joppa Radio, a cable Comcast on the local channel here in Newburyport or your given community. But Ed Muskie worked hard to make it happen. George Mitchell, not as well known. He was a senator from Maine. But in 1987, he was very valuable for clean water. President Ronald Reagan wanted to get rid of the grants for sewage treatment plants, and he had a lot of support. But Mitchell was powerful then. He said, all right, let's compromise. We won't get grants anymore, but let us have low interest loans so we can borrow the money, pay it back. See, a grant is great because say it's $50 million, you only have to pay back perhaps, 5 to 10%. A loan, you have to pay it all back. But a low interest loan, at least right now, is 1.5%. So that is good. And George Mitchell was the legislator who got the amendments for loans done in 1987. Now, Congresswoman Laurie Trahan of the Lowell area is working to get low interest loans for all communities now. He was a great champion of the river, a great champion of Lowell, of course, but also of the river. And I love this photo. It's his wife, Nikki, who after his death, she became a congresswoman from the Lowell area. And he was very valuable for the Merrimack River. And this is a poignant shot. And radio listeners, I'm showing you a picture of Paul Tsongas's grave site overlooking the Merrimack River. Here is the Whittier Bridge, almost $300 million. It's been finished. It's very valuable and named after our poet that we just talked about. Here's an example of something we don't like. This is not coming from a sewage treatment plant. It's coming from a street runoff in Methuen. But, you know, bad things happen. There are just a lot of junk below it. And there are different groups, almost 50 groups actually trying to keep the river clean. And getting debris out of the river like this is one of the goals. And in Newburyport, there are similar situations. This is an example of a runoff pipe, and it's going right into the river. This is one of the most beautiful shots that I think that we have. Clean Water Act came along, more boats are coming down. Summer on the Merrimack River is pretty good. And here we see something from the top, the Merrimack Valley. John McCone, who is with the Merrimack River Watershed Council, and I have concluded this is the Haverhill-Amesbury line. And for listeners on the radio, this is a shot from a drone, and it's looking down at the Merrimack River, and quite beautiful it is. This is one of the heroes. I'm going to make this the last shot because we're almost full, but a great hero to the Merrimack, Ellen Swallow Richards, a century and a half ago, first woman to graduate from MIT. People were getting typhoid in the Lawrence area from bad water. She and others came up here, determined a better way to clean the water, and really made an enormous difference, saved lives. And what they did in Lawrence under her guidance was copied in Lowell and along the river and became the national marker for clean water. So we're going to stop with Ellen Swallow Richards today. She was a great hero, perhaps, you know, not as well known, but when we want to think of clean water on the Merrimack, and when we think of those 500,000 people who are still drinking water from the Merrimack, Ellen Swallow Richards has to be remembered. And I always like to highlight women when I can, because so much of history is written about men, by men. So if you find, you know, a woman who is so remarkable, I think it's worth bringing out. So that's it for the day. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I enjoy doing this show on radio, on the cable. My book is finished. I'm just putting the final touches on it. When it gets here, you'll hear about it, believe me. But until then, thank you very much for tuning in to Life Along the Merrimack, 96.3 Joppa Radio. And we'll see you next week. Have a good holiday.